Hey, kia ora koutou whānau. Welcome back to another edition of the Department of Conversation. Very good to be back with you. A bit of a special tonight, bit of a last minute special, actually. I've had a chance and an ability before to hang out and to spend time with, in podcasting, Katherine Mangu-Ward, an American commentator, lives in DC, the District of Columbia, and is the editor-in-chief of Reason magazine. There's Reason magazine, their website, reason.com. Free minds and free markets. It's a website and I guess an ideology dedicated to libertarianism. Katherine Mangu-Ward is the Vice President of Journalism and Editor-in-Chief of Reason, overseeing all of Reason's print, digital, and video journalism. Overtly and plainly defines herself as a libertarian journalist, as it says here on her TEDx profile, leading voice of American libertarianism, editor-in-chief of Reason, the magazine of free minds and free markets. Now, it's really interesting, right? Because libertarianism here in New Zealand is sort of seen almost as a far-right position, because we associate libertarianism with the ACT Party and David Seymour in general, right? I know that it's not, I know that I'm being a little bit, I guess, OTT with my saying, but in general, a very, very general way, that's how we describe it. Whereas when I was talking to Katherine, this is not in the conversation about actually Chewy and mine's our conversation around the political compass. Katherine identified herself as being like obviously as libertarian as possible, all the way down the bottom, but right in the center of right and left. And quite quickly during this conversation, which originally was going to be 15 minutes and was originally going to be sort of about the midterms and Donald Trump's announcement, we got into a bit of a philosophical conversation about libertarianism, and it's just worth playing. So that's what we're going to be doing tonight. It kind of occurred to me that in its purest sense, libertarianism is probably a centrist position. So if it is a centrist position, why do we see it as a right or a far right ideology? Because libertarianism is like freedom for anything. So whether it's drugs or marriage or, you know, LGBT issues and desires, that's all kind of left-wing stuff. But and it's also things like, you know, don't tell me what to do with my business. It's all the things like gun rights in America, which is kind of on the right. So it was a really interesting conversation, and I just thought, to be honest with you, I could do what we've talked about doing, which is take some chunks from it and play it out for you tonight. But what you'll see is quite a free-flowing, almost thought experiment about what would a libertarian society look like and how it would actually function. I'm not on board, but that's not because I'm not certainly more libertarian than many, but because I always think about, in this idealistic libertarianist society, those that can't, those that need, those that don't have the choices because of lots of reasons will get left behind. And those that can, and those that do, and those that have the ability to make choices for themselves will thrive in it. So I guess my perspective is probably one of empathy and compassion for those that don't have the ability to have the free choice, maybe through circumstances, through financial circumstances, through sociological circumstances, through health circumstances, that those of us that can make choices would. So whilst I certainly lean libertarian in lots of my views, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, go to our Facebook page. In fact, let me put the link up here for our Facebook page so you can go and have a look if you want. There it is there. And have a look for Chewy and mine's political compass, and you'll see I'm right down the bottom by libertarian. But I think I'm over to the left as well because of empathy and compassion. I honestly think that's what it is, because empathy and compassion also goes, look, my freedoms, my desires for libertarianism, but actually I care and I'm concerned about you as well. And I think that's probably why I swing so far left and I'm so far down the bottom towards libertarianism. But look, it was a fascinating conversation, and I wanted to just, rather than play the clips, just play the whole thing. So tonight's podcast, tonight's show, is a long-form conversation between myself and Katherine Mangu-Ward. We do talk about politics, we do talk about Trump, we do talk about the midterms, but we do talk also a lot about the ideology of libertarianism. Before we do this, I want to bring to your attention as well, obviously, our Patreon, and love to have you on board. If you're someone who's a fan of supporting what we do, if you enjoy and like what we do, then you can visit our Patreon and become a member. We do talk quite a bit about Elon Musk in this conversation, actually, and this libertarian view of just firing people when you want. And I'm not on board. The other thing about these isms, and I do talk about this in the conversation, is isms at their purest all seem to be okay, but isms in practice, whether it's capitalism, libertarianism, socialism, communism, whatever they are, because we are failed beings as humans, we fuck it up. In other words, we involve ourselves in these purist senses, and we bring our biases, and we bring our own perspectives, and we bring our desires, and it basically moves away from the pure ism that you're talking about, whatever that ism is. So if you want to be involved and help us continue to do what we're doing, then the Patreon is patreon.com/Big Hairy News. Just a reminder as well that tomorrow morning, Saturday morning, 11 a.m., we're having a group meetup. If you're already a patron, you will have received the link for that group meetup. If you haven't received the link, it's in the messages on Patreon. Now, you should have an email notification for that. Go look in your spam if it hasn't turned up. Tomorrow morning, 11 a.m., we'll be meeting up. If you decide to jump on board, and you could jump on board with the fuck you Elon level, FUEL, which is only $8 a month. And if you sign on board with that for only $8 a month, Elon gives you 1 tick. Well, he kind of doesn't anymore because they've pulled back on that, doesn't it? We'll give you 2 ticks. You get a social media surround with 2 ticks on it. So if you want to be involved in the chat tomorrow morning, then jump on board and be a part of our Patreon. If you like what we're doing and you want to support us, be a part of our Patreon. And I assume, and I think you'll particularly enjoy this conversation we're having tonight. It's Katherine Mangu-Ward from the US, editor-in-chief of Reason magazine, and me talking American politics and libertarianism. All right. Hey, let's have a chat. It's obviously Friday, New Zealand time, Thursday, your time. And I guess it might be good to get your perspective for people who don't know your work and don't know who you are. I'm sure there's only 1 out of 1 million people there, Katherine. Obviously, you are the chief and the editor-in-chief, of Reason.com, which is also a physical magazine, isn't it? I think I asked you that last time. Editor-in-chief of Reason.com.
That's right. We do Dead Tree, we do video, we do podcasts, we do newsletters, and of course, the website that you are showing right now.
And for people who don't know what Reason is, can you synopsize it to us in a sentence or I was going to say, or less, in a few sentences?
Or less. I can.
Yeah.
I'll be brief. Our motto is free minds and free markets. We're a libertarian magazine. So we cover politics, but we also cover kind of culture, policy, general news, all from the perspective that freedom and choice are the most important thing.
And the libertarian aspect comes out quite heavily in a tweet that I saw the other day that says, I, of course, would like to see more legalized heroin, etc. Cocaine and vending machines is the American way, but I will take this. And obviously the purist in the libertarian world is like, let people do whatever they want, make it all legal, and let adults make their own decisions. Maybe a bad paraphrase, but is that fair about the purist libertarian view?
Yes, I think that's right. A lot of libertarians are actually quite engaged in kind of policy making and day-to-day incremental work. But it's certainly my view that a huge amount of what government does, and especially restrictions that it puts on people to stop them from doing things that are not bad for anyone besides themselves,
Yep.
that those are laws we should work to get rid of.
It is, of course, always interesting to think about if we do something to ourselves, does it only impact ourselves? Because there are other people around us. I mean, like certainly in New Zealand was very sad to see we had a referendum at the last election about legalizing cannabis, or certainly decriminalizing it, that didn't get through, which I thought was a travesty. So I'm certainly in that camp. But you also can't deny that, if a parent of 3 young children is doing something to themselves, and that harms and impacts them, it can flow on to impact other people. So it can be a nuanced conversation at times, can't it?
Absolutely. And I think, unfortunately, far too often politicians exploit the particular trouble that you've just targeted there, the kind of for the children exception. And that too often winds up, I think, being just an excuse to put restrictions on adults who, again, you could make that argument about everything, right? Like, of course, no man is an island. Of course, everything we do has trickle-down effects, has impacts on other people, our families, our coworkers, our neighbors. But there's certainly a large body of political theory that has explored the question of, well, where are the limits? Where do we say this is something that causes clear harm to others? And so, for instance, I think a law against murder. There we go. No problem. We all agree. But when we get to stuff like what kind of contracts are you allowed to make for employment, or what kind of substances are you allowed to consume and how much of them, or what are you allowed to do with your body, that I think is a clearer case, a stronger case, and It isn't to say that people won't abuse these freedoms. They may, but the prohibitions can be much, much worse, including, of course, here in the US, we have an incredibly high rate of incarceration, many, many thousands of people in jail for doing stuff that didn't hurt anyone else.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, listen, we were going to talk about election and Trump and that kind of stuff, but I feel this very quickly turning into a philosophical conversation.
I mean, I'm up for both. Why not both?
The thing about the libertarianism, I've always kind of been of the opinion that most isms, when it comes to political or market sense, in their purest sense, seem pretty good. Almost any ism, but what we do as human beings is we get ourselves involved, and because we're flawed, we flaw the system. But if you take most isms at their absolute purest, they seem to be, a fine, workable, if you look at what they actually are, the dictionary definition of them. And I think about libertarianism, and I think, whilst I certainly think I've probably got some libertarian, freedom tendencies, I don't typically label myself as to where I sit exactly. But it's this nuance in this, what we do to harm ourselves, but sometimes what we do to harm ourselves does flow on to other people. I'm thinking about alcohol, for example. Drink as much as you want, whatever you want to do, but then the impairment that comes with that leads the person to get into the car, which does kill the other person. So I guess it's like, do whatever you want to yourself with alcohol, but then we have to have a law in there about driving. Relates right to the alcohol that you do whatever yourself to. So I wonder how that would work. Like the libertarianism is a purest sense, fine. And then you have to apply it to real world applications. How do we manage that?
I mean, I think we have real world answers to that question already, right? Alcohol is already legal in the United States and in most places. And in the places where alcohol is legal, we still have laws against hitting people with your car. And that seems like a pretty easy way forward. The fact that we haven't followed that template with other substances, I think, really calls into question, well, what is it? Is there really something deep, underlying, importantly different about alcohol, or is it just custom? Is it just that we're used to letting people do harm to themselves in this way, and in other ways that feels new and scary? I would say there's a fair amount of hypocrisy in those rules, and I would further say, you mentioned people are going to make mistakes, and that those mistakes are going to flow onto others. The surest way to make those mistakes flow onto others is to give those people power over others. We have a lot of politicians who are deeply flawed and in charge of what I can say, think, buy, do, read, and that's not working out that well.
I just harking back before we actually move on to what we were going to talk about, the idea about, contracts and that kind of stuff. I don't know. I mean, I guess I come from a place where I've seen people taken advantage of in the workplace. And at the moment, I'm thinking particularly about Elon Musk fucking firing people over Twitter at 1:30 in the morning because they criticized him. All these stories that are going around at the moment. So I can really see a case for having protections within a contract in an employment situation, so you don't suffer at the hands of a person who has maybe become tyrannical and had their ego hurt when you have done nothing wrong. In fact, you might be a good worker, but because someone's offended, they can then just get rid of you. So I like the idea of being able to have the freedoms within the contract, but I also like the idea of being as an employer having that, but I also like as an employee to have those securities that I know that if I upset my boss, they can't go, no, you're gone. There's a process to go through to demonstrate that my work is worthy of being fired, rather than just got rid of because I don't like your vibe anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I am a big fan of Elon's efforts in space, especially
and cars,
electric vehicles. I think
the cars,
is a really
for sure.
important development. So when it comes to this Twitter mess, I have to say, I'm not angry, Elon. I'm just disappointed. I want this man, who I think is a bona fide genius, to focus on the stuff where he's really creating value. I don't think he is doing that at Twitter, but I will say, of course, you're right that it sucks to be fired at 1 a.m. On the other hand, the most talented engineers and other many other employees at Twitter, they already had job offers by the end of the day. You know what I mean? And so I do think there is a discipline that is imposed on employers by the market. We don't necessarily always need to make it a law. I know, as someone who employs a bunch of journalists, that if I treat people badly, they'll leave. They'll go get another job. And that's a check on my behavior as much as any law.
I think that, again, in its purest sense, I think what you're saying is fair, but we live in a time and in a world where, yeah, sure, the highest coders at Twitter are probably flocked off to Snapchat or to, you know, Instagram or to whatever else. But if we then take all those highly skilled, highly sought after workers away and apply the same thing to someone working in a grocery store, you know, a low skill job, and they piss off their boss and they get fired, it's a bit harder sometimes for those people then just to walk into another job. And I can see how those protections can be a valuable thing. I see it. I don't disagree that, you know, if you're sought after in your work field, then you'll find another job. But the question is, what about those people who aren't? Those people who are doing the jobs at the bottom that no one else wants to do, but we need desperately done, or as we saw with the pandemic, the world will fall over. You know, if you don't have the people packing the groceries, and if you're in a particular time in the economy, which may not be now, but let's say it is, where it's hard to get a job, then it's not quite so easy for some of the unskilled people to just flip between jobs. Oh yeah, my boss is a cunt, got rid of me, no big deal, I'll just get another job. Not quite as easy. You know what I mean?
I mean, I think you're totally right to be compassionate to people who are often kind of economically hanging on by the skin of their teeth. But I do also think, you know, there's nothing about unskilled job markets that is on a fundamental level different from these highly skilled Twitter coders, say. Um, you know, those jobs are, they do have rapid turnover. You know, those jobs, in when there's low unemployment, you can find another job. The other thing, though, is it's just not clear to me that the better thing for society is to make laws that say you have to keep underperforming employees on your payroll,
Well, I
right?
think
Like,
there's an, but
if
I
I'm a
think there's
big
an in between. I think there's an in between. I don't think that's why I'm saying at its purest sense. I don't think the idea of libertarian is bad, but I think there's an in between. And like I know here in New Zealand, I don't know how it works in the US. It seems like you can just be fired whenever in the US if you're following Elon's example. And here in New Zealand, there's a system. If you're underperforming, you can get a warning and then another warning, and then you can be let go of. So it's not like you're stuck with them forever, but there are some protections to go. You're not just going to be fired immediately because, you know, you say something bad about your boss. So I think there's an in between the whole, oh God, these terrible people we have to keep around forever, and actually you looked at me the wrong way, get rid of you. The middle ground seems to be, I think, what we should be aiming for.
I think sometimes the middle ground is just a bad compromise, honestly. And like again, I think I see what you're saying. In fact, in the US, there are all kinds of employment laws, right? We do have at-will employment here, but it is heavily circumscribed. You can't say, I don't like the way that you looked at me, or I don't like the outfit you wore, so you're fired, right? Like there are in fact laws against that here. But you know, I
That's
also think,
that's basically what's been happening at Twitter, though. I mean, there was a very good
well,
example
he's gonna
over the
get sued.
weekend. Yeah, because over the weekend there was a guy, and I could bring it up if we needed to, who Elon put out an apology about how it was performing on Android, Twitter was, to which one of the coders or one of the engineers said, you know, I've been working on this on Twitter for 6 years. I disagree with the statement. Elon Musk says, what have you done about it? The guy put up like 6 tweets full of jargon as to what he's done about it. The next tweet from Elon was, you're fired. Like literally. So he basically showed Elon up on Twitter and got fired for it. There's no employment issue there. There's a thin
Right.
skin issue there.
I'm definitely not going to defend what Elon is doing at Twitter. I don't think it's good business, but I do think that it's, you know, it is often the case that the laws, as we have them in the United States, and they are less aggressive in the US than in other countries. I think everyone knows of many, many circumstances where someone is, you know, being strung along, their employment is being dragged out. They know they're going to get fired, and it's just this formality. And I'm not sure that that does anyone any favors. Again, I think broadly, the more you open up your labor markets, the better it's going to be for workers. I really do believe that. Like, this is
Mm.
not me sort of being like pro management, anti worker. I really think a more fluid labor market, a labor market where people can come in from other countries and bring their skills, a labor market where people are more open to um, unusual credentials, right? One consequence of a very regulated labor market is that employers become really cautious. They won't take a chance on someone
Yeah, yeah.
that they might be stuck with for years.
Yeah, yeah.
I want people who don't have experience to get cool new jobs. I want people whose credentials are unusual to get new jobs, and I think that these regulations can get in the way of that.
I'll tell you something that we have in New Zealand. It was quite controversial when it came out. We have like a 90-day law, and it basically means you sign a contract or you get employed, and if it doesn't work out, the employer can get rid of you after 90 days. It's almost like a trial period, and it's law in New Zealand that you can apply to a contract. So even if you've signed a contract, there's still like a 90-day get out of get out of jail, whatever the word would be,
well,
clause.
depends on if you think work is jail. But
Yeah,
I mean, the reason you need that law is because your employment regulation is already so aggressive, right? I mean, you don't need the 90-day get out of a contract period if you're allowed to just employers and employees are allowed to make whatever contracts make sense for them.
I think what I want in my Pollyanna idealistic world is the best for both parties. What's best for the worker and best for the employer. What's best
That's
for
what everybody wants.
the
It's
business.
just a disagreement about how to get there.
And this is where, because humans are failed, we come in, and whether you are the world's worst worker and the business can't get rid of you, that's not a good solution. But if you're also a good worker and you've done nothing wrong, but you've offended the boss and they can get rid of you, that's also not a good solution. So I don't know. Failed human beings do failed things, I guess.
We sure do.
Hey, let's have a look at the because we're a few days into it now. I'm actually really interested. I wrote it down as you were talking about libertarianism. What the hell does a libertarian in America do with their vote at the moment? Because I mean, like, it's where do you go? Who do you support? I mean, from this side of the world, looking over at the shit show that is U.S. politics, albeit very entertaining shit show. Like, it's nice being this many thousands of miles away watching it. You know, you've got this what appears to me to be a bit of a lunatic, you know, throwing his hat back in the role to, and I say a bit of a lunatic out of respect almost for you, Katherine, not knowing where you're put up, because I mean, complete lunatic, liar, philanderer, thief, all those things there in my opinion. But I'm being respectful because I've never actually asked you where your vote is. You may be a Trump supporter, I don't know. But how does a libertarian weigh up the view when your kind of driving force is sort of freedom? Like, what do you do? Because no matter what the right tells us about being pro-freedom, they want to bring in laws that stop abortion, for example, and completely get into that decision. You know, whatever the left says, which is pro-freedom, they're the ones that tend to eat themselves and actually, you know, are the ones that, you know, if you say the wrong word the wrong way, you're now in trouble as well. So what is someone who's at their purest sense wants pure freedom? What do you do with your vote? How do you navigate that political world?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, it's a moment for despair for people who value freedom. Just to be clear, I agree with you that Donald Trump is, you know, his return to our politics is not going to have a positive effect, inevitable though it may have been. And you know, I've been a political journalist for a long time, and most of my career, there have been a few politicians that I thought, okay, you know, these guys are not 100% on my wavelength, but they're good enough. You know, some members of Congress, some folks that are out there, you know, maybe there's stars rising, maybe there is a libertarian
Like
thread in our politics.
the Ron Pauls of this world, that
Right.
sort of thing.
So Ron Paul is an example of that for a lot of people. There was really a moment when he kind of became ascendant in 2008, whenever it was, that a lot of young people, especially, said like, "Oh, what this guy is saying makes a lot of sense to me." And he's a backbencher, right? Like he was not a powerful man in Washington, but he was a long-standing member of Congress, someone that people knew was at least a part of the debate. And he ran for president. It was not a successful run, but it did did garner some attention and certainly shaped a lot of people's worldview. There is no one like that on the scene right now. And I think even worse, it's not like typically libertarians are out here winning elections. The Libertarian Party is in a particularly bad shape right now, but was never a dominant force in US politics and wasn't positioned to be. But I think much more troubling is that the Republicans and the Democrats are also both philosophically moving away from classical liberalism. They're moving away from, I think, an older consensus that you could have pointed to in American politics around certain things like free speech, civil liberties, rule of law, some basic kind of tenets of civility. And I think, we used to say as libertarians, okay, listen, the Republican Party, they're a bunch of authoritarian jerks, but at least on economics, at least they say they're trying to balance the budget. At least they say they want people to keep more of their own money. At least they say, property rights matter. They stopped saying that. They just stopped saying that stuff. They don't say that stuff anymore. They don't do that stuff anymore for the most part. And conversely, on the left, the Democrats, they used to really say, we're going to stick up for civil liberties. We're going to stick up for privacy. We're going to stick up for free speech. You know, the kind of American Civil Liberties Union is this like giant in the world of these classical liberal values. That is not true anymore either, right? The American left has gone much more progressive and even kind of democratic socialist. And the thing that the two sides have in common now is that they both say we should do anything we can to get and hold power, and then we should wield the power of the state for our own ends. And both of them used to have a note of within the bounds of, you know, appropriate political action, or within kind of a constitutional understanding of the limits of government, you know, roles and responsibilities. That has really gone out the window. It's not Trump's fault. It predated Trump, but Trump certainly accelerated it.
He was also the pinnacle.
Election,
he was the pinnacle of it, wasn't it? You could see it going, and then Trump was like the flag at the top of the mountain.
Right. And this election has not reversed that course. This election, you know, a lot of the sort of Trumpiest candidates did lose. A lot of the MAGA candidates lost, but they still lost to culture warriors with authoritarian impulses on both sides.
Yeah, that authoritarian thing on the left is very troubling, isn't it? I'm one of my co-hosts here, me and Chewy, we did a thing the other day on the show where we did our political compass, and both of us were on the left. Both of us were quite on the left and quite right down near libertarianism, like right in the bottom left-hand corner. And the thing about the left at the moment and their authoritarian nature is, I've always said this, that the right seem to do politics better because they come behind one person with one voice. I mean, you can see it with Trump, you know, how everyone just got in lockstep behind Trump, although his ideologies and policies and basically his being was completely abhorrent to so many of them. But then they got him behind him because the right gets into lockstep and gets behind one message. The left tends to eat their own and be like, if you're not where we are on the left, then you're not a part of our team and you're almost the enemy. And I've heard many commentators who grew up being very left-wing voters and supporters saying, you know, it used to be the party of free speech. It used to be the party of, like you're saying, the ACLU. And I talked to his name jumps out of my head. He did the famous Skokie case from the ACLU, the professor who defended the Nazis from the ACLU.
I had a podcast. Finest hour.
I had a podcast with him, and he's now standing up saying this is not what it used to be. And you know, their front page of the ACLU website at the moment looks like it's a left-wing sort of virtue signaling message board, as opposed to this bastion of free speech. So
Trump did that too. Right? What happened at the ACLU, in part at least, is that they had an incredible influx of money from people who were looking for a way to oppose Donald Trump. And, you know, if you look around the American political landscape and you say, all right, Trump is president, somebody needs to constrain him. Who has the reputation, who has the resources, who has the strategy to do that? And people say, well, maybe the ACLU. I like those guys. Yeah. Maybe I'll give to the ACLU. But then the trouble was they ended up with this massive kind of dump of money that wasn't really about defending civil liberties. It was really about beating Trump. And that takes you unfortunate places, I think. And, you know, I still believe that the ACLU does a lot of good. I think their work on immigration policy, for instance, is really very solid. And they still do take free speech cases that are important that nobody else really does. But they also, I don't know that they defend the Skokie Nazis today. You know, they now turn down requests of assistance from people who say they might be armed at their rallies, for instance, which, whether or not you think that's a good idea, used to be something they defended and is certainly a very American idea of showing up at your rally with your firearm. That's not, you know, that's not what the old ACLU would have done. And I mourn it.
No, look, I agree with you. And here it is here. This is the front page. And they have it listed in here somewhere, where they were defended.
He's right there, Trump, right?
Nazis.
Front and center.
Yeah, they defend, and they still had, I'm having a look for it, ACLU Supreme Court, Interracial marriage. Yeah, so it's a different animal now. Oh, here it is here. So this is the one here. ACLU took a controversial stand for free speech by defending Nazi group they wanted to march through the Chicago suburb of Skokie, where many Holocaust survivors were. And it's almost like, as you say, that they wouldn't do that today, but they're still happy to put it up there as part of their history. It's a bit like the Republicans saying, you know, we were the party of Lincoln, when what they stand for today is nothing compared to what that was. It's like getting it's clout chasing from what you used to be about, and you're now not about that anymore. Hey, answer me this, to do with voting and stuff as well. Our experience of Libertarians here in New Zealand is a party called the ACT Party, and they are run by a guy called David Seymour, and their policies are pretty much far right policies. And is it fair to say that a lot of, and I'm not necessarily even asking about you, but a lot of libertarians and a lot of libertarian ideology sit better on the right than the left? I mean, David Seymour seems to want, they scream equality, and they scream everyone should be the same under the law, but then the only things that David Seymour puts into the media is based on race. Like, because we have an Indigenous people here in New Zealand, Māori people, and we have an agreement between the Crown and Māori, a treaty back when the country started, that says Māori get these rights and privileges, and the Crown has to provide X, Y, Z for this other party in this contract. Whereas what David Seymour does, and I talked about this last night, and I've talked about this a lot, is all he calls out for is equality when it comes to race. He never calls out equality when it comes to the other protected classes under the Human Rights Act, like age or disability or religion. You know, he's fine to have male-only priests in the Catholic Church. I mean, that's discriminatory, but that's okay because that's religion. But when it comes to race, he really wants to see equality, and that's all he ever talks about. And so the position I have for him, and this is not necessarily about libertarians in general, although he wears the libertarian badge here in New Zealand, is the reason that comes across as sort of racially dividing or racist is it's not because he's wanting equality based on race, is that all he ever talks, and he only wants equality based on race. He doesn't want equality in any of the other protected classes. He only wants equality based on race. And that's all he ever talks about, and it just comes across as a dog whistle to his base, which end up being far right, because that's what they want to hear. They want to hear, oh yeah, let's smash that minority sort of thing. So long-winded, but my experience of libertarian and politics is kind of a far right perspective, because that's what we see here. Do libertarians sit across the board that you're experienced, or do they sit more comfortably on the right than the left?
You know, this is an eternal debate within American libertarian circles. Historically, it is true that American libertarians have had more of an affiliation with the right, but I would say that comes largely from, as I mentioned earlier, the right's now somewhat abandoned commitments to free markets and free trade. Right. And because that's a really big deal for American libertarians, that has been, you know, one of the kind of things that glue American libertarians to the American right. At the same time, there's always been a huge amount that American libertarians have had in common with the left. And the founding of the Libertarian Party, one of the biggest driving forces of that was ending the draft, right? Which is the most classic lefty, you know, burn the draft card. It's a bunch of hippies, you know, smoking pot and burning their draft cards. And that was a real part of the original libertarian movement as well. So there really are these kind of left roots and right roots. You know, I think that American libertarians are experiencing something similar to what you just described. There's been kind of a change in leadership in the American Libertarian Party, and they are much more, I would say they've sort of leaned more like trollish, much more edgelordy, and much more Trumpy in ways that I don't like to see. I don't think that means all libertarians in the U.S. or even all members of the Libertarian Party are like that, but the leadership is trending that way. I think that that's actually, though, something that's bigger even than the libertarians in the world. I mean, we are seeing this everywhere, right? We have a rise around the world of populist right-wingery. And that is, you know, we can see it, and hopefully ebbing a little bit at this point, but, you know, Viktor Orban, Bolsonaro, you know, there's all around the world these sort of this winning political formula, which is to be nativist, to be kind of, fighting a culture war or like encouraging kind of culture war style grievances, a certain amount of social conservatism, and that, for whatever reason, is a mode for politicians who want to get elected that does seem to be showing pretty well right now. So it's not surprising to me actually that libertarians would be following that as well. And I don't think it's necessarily something intrinsic to libertarianism. I think it just might be kind of our political moment. But I definitely deplore it. I think Americans want a third thing because the two things we have suck. Like they have to want a third thing. And I think a true kind of moderate libertarianism has a lot to offer to Americans who do have these libertarian tendencies, right? I mean, this is the nation that is the home of, guys who just want to be left alone out on their farm with their guns to grow pot and get gay married. Like that's all I want for them, And I do think there is a libertarian thread in America, and you'll forgive if I'm using stereotypes here, but I think in New Zealand as well. I think there's some of that energy in New Zealand.
Well, the one of the beauties we have here is probably after the next election, we'll have 5 parties in our government. So we're not a two-party state, and our left, for example, is made up of the Labour Party, which is the current largest party, which won't be the largest party after the next election, and the Green Party. So basically, your progressive Democrats would be your far left wing of the Democratic Party. That's our Green Party, and your centrist Democrats, that's our Labour Party, and your centrist Republicans are our National Party, and your Trumpian Republicans are our ACT Party. So actually, we're not dissimilar in the people who are in government or in the houses of power, but because we've got 4 parties who are in now, then the right-wing lunatic who thinks that this is what libertarian is all about, that squashing minorities, has got a place to go, and the freedom-loving hippie or whatever it is who just wants to smoke pot and sit on the beach and be a feet can go to the far left. Terrible stereotypes I'm using here, but what I'm saying is there's a place for everybody to go, and there's also parties in the middle. So there's a couple of things I was going to ask actually. Does that therefore mean that actually a true quote unquote libertarian party should be centrist? Because when you use those examples, you were like, oh, grow their pot. And I went, oh, that's lefty. Have their guns. Oh, that's from the right. Oh, so that was like everything you were saying was like, although my stereotype is like that way, that way, that way, that way. What is it? Should a true libertarian party you should see people joining it who are traditionally left and right, because if it applies if freedom is the mantle, then that should attract people from both sides.
Yeah, so this is something that it's been kind of a meme in libertarian discourse for a long time. Like libertarians are the true moderates, and I did not used to think that was a good framing, and that's partially because of the way in the U.S. we do just have these 2 major parties. They have large moderate components, right? I mean, because there are the 2 major parties, moderates have chosen one party or the other. And, the center of gravity of our 2 parties does tend to be more moderate. But I think this change that I was describing earlier, in which both parties have moved away from what I see as this kind of very American consensus around respecting civil liberties, leaving people alone, letting people have private property, I think that's left a gap in the middle. And so I do think at this point that the shape of that hole in the middle, the shape of that gap looks pretty libertarian to me. Not every independent is going to be a libertarian. Absolutely not. I mean, it is a specific political philosophy. It is a specific worldview. And some things that I want to do are absolutely radical and not centrist or not moderate. I want to legalize all drugs. That's not a moderate position in the US. But I think there is something very libertarian about what I perceive to be the center of gravity in US politics, and in particular, the underserved voter, the voter who's looking at the 2 major candidates out there and just saying, neither of these guys speaks to me at all. And right now, we have a tremendous amount of non-voters. I mean, we really do not have high election participation rates, even though these midterm elections had very high turnout for us. Some of those non-voters could be all over the map, but I think a lot of them are like me. I think a lot of them are just like, I won't vote for either of these guys. I won't be complicit in this mess.
So after 100 years, let's just say, and going into this two-party mess you've got in the US, other than the odd one like the Ron Paul or the Bernie Sanders, but I was thinking before, the Bernie Sanders to the left is what Ron Paul was to the right, probably. That sort of independent, slightly different, somewhere to go, but nothing's growing up in the middle. How does that ever happen? I mean, how does that happen? Because every election cycle, when this conversation happens, it's like, well, look what's happening in Georgia. Because the third party took 2.1%. You've got a guy who's got brain damage that might well get into Senate because the third party took 2.1% away from that overall post and someone needed 50.1%. So how does that become a reality of having a viable third party in the US?
It's a problem because the two major parties, not surprisingly, have engineered a bunch of different ways of locking down the system. So the people in power, who are all members of those two parties, make the rules about our elections. And so it means that in various, each state makes their own rules about who has access to the ballot, right? Like whose name appears on the ballot. And they make it hard for a third party to get on the ballot and stay on the ballot, right? It's not just you say you're running for office, maybe you get a few votes once and you can be on the ballot. No, like you have to get a bunch of signatures, you have to jump through a bunch of hoops. It's really quite tricky, and that's by design. There also, at the presidential level, there's commission that determines who gets to participate in presidential debates. And you will be not at all surprised to learn that if you build a commission out of half Democrats and half Republicans, they are not going to go out of their way to let a third party on the stage where Americans can hear them. So there's just a bunch of things in the system that are structured to block out third parties. Frankly, this is one reason that I don't get super invested in electoral politics and why I am not actually a member of the Libertarian Party. I think the barriers are too great to electoral success for libertarians as libertarians. And I want to focus my energy instead on influencing policy, making headway within the two parties, and changing the culture. Again, can't say I feel that this last election shows I'm succeeding at that, but that's the plan.
Speaking more on libertarianism, because I'm fascinated by the concept of it. How does one protect minorities in a purist libertarian perspective? Because sometimes making legislation or law for something that is helpful or appropriate for a very small group of people is the appropriate thing to do. So as a libertarian, how does one make sure that when I say minorities, I don't necessarily mean race. Like I always talk about dog owners are a minority, whatever the minority is. How does one protect what's best for minorities in a libertarian world? When libertarian world often seems to me to be sort of freedom for everyone, but that would also flow into sort of majority rule, because if most people want those freedoms, then that's going to be the biggest slice of the population.
Yeah, so I would frame it a little differently. I would say, we already have a democratic system, right? Or a republic, if you like. So we already have all of these pitfalls for any minority that we do things by voting and we do things by majorities. For me, the protection for minorities is taking as much as possible out of the hands of those majorities. So if we say this isn't the business of the state at all, then the majority can't vote on it. So for instance, what I was saying earlier about just having really broad-based protections for privacy, civil liberties, private property, like if you say my right to free speech is not subject to a vote, that is something that is fundamental and it is protected, and we are not going to make this a part of the political process. My right to due process is not subject to political debate. I think that that's a goal. Now, of course, that's an eternal battle, right? Like you don't win that once and then you're like, all right, well, that's not political anymore. But I do think, there are lots of reasons, including, the way that the law currently works in most kind of Western countries and many, many others, that you can carve out kind of non-political rights and that you can protect those. So, when I think about people who are not currently in power or people who are minorities, I don't think that the current system does a good job of protecting them. I don't think the current system does a good job of kind of keeping them safe from the whims of the majority. And I
Right.
think it's worth trying something different.
You're also talking about sort of self autonomy, though. It sounds like you're talking about people should be left to do what they want. When it comes, in my mind, to protecting minorities, there is legislation. Like if it was a funding issue, then that's actually not about I can do what I want, leave me alone to be me. That's about how does a government interact with this minority. Whereas the funding for issue X within this minority, if we live on basically a purely sort of libertarian view of the things, you kind of can't keep government out of those, because if we're talking about like governmental things that need to be done, let's say it's funding for a group of people who need a particular health need, and it's a minority of people. Let's say it's 80-year-olds and hip replacements. I don't know. It doesn't matter. So I'm always aware of this conversation that people go straight to race when they're listening. I'm not necessarily talking about that. I'm talking about any minority that needs some help for appropriate reasons from a government agency or from the government. Then you can't keep government out of that. So how do we approach that to protect that kind of minority issue from a purely libertarian point of view?
Yeah. So I would say I always want to start with the status quo, right? Like I always want to start with what is, because I think, if you stack up any proposed system against an ideal, it's going to lose. But I think, right now, for instance, we have in the US, we have a system where there's an entitlement for retirement, right? Social Security, and
Yep.
everyone gets it, right? So you turn 65, 67, 68, you get a check from the government. The size of that check is determined by how much you paid in, and there's a bunch of other things going on, but like that's a universal entitlement.
Mm-hmm.
The people who get that check are an interest group, right? There's a huge amount of lobbying around who gets that check. They
For
are
sure.
a noisy minority that has bought influence from powerful people, and they get the checks. Now, I think you can and should set aside, like, they've been promised these checks, right? They plan their lives around these checks. And so I'm not saying we turn them off tomorrow. I don't think anybody who's being realistic is saying that. But it seems clear to me that a better system would be, don't send those checks to rich people.
Mm.
Don't send those checks to people who don't need them. Send them to people in need, right? Like even if you are going to have a system like this one, it could be much better designed. It is not designed that way because our system is built for people who hold power to seek constituencies within these special interests and to keep the status quo in place. I think that, the thing that makes sense to me is to imagine a system where, um, where again, we don't put all of this in the hands of a bunch of idiots. I mean, it's, Congress is not Mensa. Congress is not even terribly well intentioned. They are not very good at writing laws. And, I don't think the solution is get a better Congress, because I don't think that's very realistic. I think the solution is, what can we take out of the hands of these bozos? What can we do to help people
But
make
but
their own
there's
choices?
but there's always massive things we can't take out of their hands. And like I've just referenced that point those before about funding, like health funding, for example. You can't just take it out of their hands for someone who needs. If a minority group needs some particular care or particular issue solved at a governmental level, then the individuals, we in the community, can't solve that. It's probably different in America, but like, I mean, let's think about people who suffered at the hands of thalidomide. You know, those are a group of people who need to have recourse. And I know probably in America there was lawsuits and all that kind of stuff. That doesn't happen all over the world. So here in New Zealand, that will be under a public health system. In most Western countries, it would be for the solution for those people. And we have to leave the decision as to what happens in the hands of the government for that. And like you said at the start of that part of your response, was you start with the status quo. So I'm still sort of trying to think through this idea of the people that suffered at the hands of thalidomide, this wonder drug that ended up causing so many problems, are now in society and have special health needs and need to be looked after in a certain way and need to have things provided to them in a certain way. And on some level, government agencies authorized that drug, so they have some responsibility of the effects of that drug because they said yes to it. And if we're living in that libertarian worldview, of what's best for the individual, how do we look after those groups when it has to be a government collective to go down that path?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you're not going to find my answer satisfactory, but I can't think of another way to frame it, which is to say, you just said governments authorize that drug, and so they bear some responsibility. Of course, that's true, but obviously, the greatest part of the responsibility rests with the people that manufactured and sold that drug. And so
Yeah.
when you say there were probably lawsuits, that's my answer. Like, if you do harm, if you, a company, if you, an individual, do harm, it is up to you to make restitution for that harm. That is what our court system is for. Now, sometimes you'll go bankrupt. Sometimes you can't make restitution for that harm. Sometimes the harm is so great that no one could make restitution for it. I think that then we can talk about, is there a safety net? Is there a role for government? But we can also talk about the way that it really happens in real life now, which is there are charities, there are mutual aid societies, there are all these other things that people do together. And I know that it's like, no, we can't leave it to charity because charity won't do everything that we want done. But like, we also can't leave it to government because government doesn't do everything we want done. And I guess I just think in a case where a clear harm has been done by a discrete entity, that's an easy one. Like, they should pay, and they should be forced to pay through a functioning court system, through clear laws. So this is not an anarchist view, but it is a libertarian one.
That's the American worldview. A libertarian in New Zealand wouldn't have that perspective, I wouldn't think, because we don't have the litigious system. Most countries don't. So,
but the alternative, right, is like, you have to pay. Like, the makers of thalidomide screwed up, and now you and every other person in New Zealand has to pay. Now, maybe you say, listen, we want this system for a variety of reasons, and many people do. But I think if the argument is like, what is just? Like, what is ideal? What is ideal is that the person who has done the harm makes restitution.
Do you think, this is almost off topic now, but it's based on thinking about the American system? I'm trying to think about how to ask this politely. I mean, the American leaders, and I'm not saying we have to put great credence in what American leaders say, because as we just said about the flawed system, and they're self-serving and money hungry and that sort of thing. But you often hear this idea about, New Zealand. Maybe I'd be right. I was about to say New Zealand is the greatest country in the world. Maybe that is true. But you often hear leaders say, America is the greatest country in the world. Donald Trump said it 23 times in his speech, and there's never been another country like this. It's the greatest country in the world. But most of us outside of America look at, for example, the gun culture and the litigious nature of the place and that sort of thing and go, we don't want that. We don't want that. You can pay us literally to have that system. So if the system is, we need to be able to sue the wrongdoers. But, and I am obviously generalizing here, but it would appear to me that most of the Western world don't want that system, or else they'd have it. Then what?
Well, I mean, for one thing, luckily we don't have a world government, right? But I actually think, this is an example of, I think that, I mean, for me, everything is this, but like, I think this is a case for libertarianism. I think it's a case for choice, in that I think people are allowed to want to live in different systems. They're allowed to want to live in different societies, and that the smaller the unit of power, the more likely it is that you're going to be able to find a system that aligns with your values. And that is going to mean that some people are going to live under systems that I think are bad, right? Like, I don't think New Zealand's way is the best way with respect to social insurance.
How
for instance.
Dare you?
How
dare you,
I'm
Katherine?
sorry to your audience. I think New Zealand is great at things that the US is not great at, right? And I would love to live in a world where there are more experiments in living, where we have more options about kind of what our deal is, what our social contract is. And I fully acknowledge that, like, the Bernie Sanders commune is going to be down the street from me, and I don't want to live there. But if people do, that's great. But what we need is a framework where we can kind of maximize the possibility that you can build a community or a city or a state that you like and have input on that. And I think that when you get a really, really big, really, really powerful national government, you're necessarily going to get something that, like, at least as significant, these minorities that you're talking about, like, a lot of people living under that regime are not going to like it and are not going to feel well served by it. And I think the more that we can take stuff out of the hands of that government, the better.
Yeah. There's two things you said there, which I'm interested in. The first is the Bernie Sanders camp down the road from you. It sounds like what we're talking about in an idealistic libertarian world is everyone's got their own pocket and can live their own way, almost like little independent villages or little independent communes, or even as little independent individuals. They just want to be themselves. But because we're so interconnected in the world and in our countries today, with everything from, infrastructure to, currency to everything, that seems to be an unrealistic, not that you're saying that that's going to happen, but an unrealistic goal. And if it's an unrealistic goal, it's kind of a little bit off the table because it's
Well,
not going to happen. But hang on, let me say, the second thing was you talked about having as many choices as possible. And like, I just feel that there are some in society, probably not you, probably not me, that don't have the ability to make some of the choices that others do. Like the idea of choice to me seems to sometimes be a bit of a first world privilege of people who not necessarily have a lot of money, but have enough money to get by. I mean, sometimes people who don't have that don't have the ability to make the choices that others would. And maybe they're the ones who need to be protected by that safety net. And they're the ones who could never participate in this utopian libertarian ideal.
yeah. So, the first point that you made, I think we already do have kind of a cascading series of authorities over us, right? Like it's already true that I am a citizen of the United States. I am, I live in the District of Columbia. I am part of a community. I'm part of a family. I'm an individual. And so I think, of course, it's true that we live in an extremely interconnected world. But, for instance, the US and New Zealand trade, and we don't have to be under a single government to work that out. Like it actually
Yep.
works really well.
Yep.
So I think, I don't think it's actually insanely utopian to say maybe we're just devolving a little more into these more local units, even if the national unit continues to exist. Um, so I think
Well,
there's kind of
but hang on, but on
we
that
have a
point,
model for that.
when
Yeah.
I in my head, when I'm seeing that picture, I'm literally seeing the infrastructure between these two villages we're talking about, the power lines that go between them. So what I'm saying is, I mean, trade between two countries is one thing because there's a separation, like a vast body of water that only allows us to send from one place to another. We're not physically connected. And look, we're getting into a bit of a thought experiment now because this is not going to happen, but I'm enjoying it. So hopefully you're okay to
Yeah.
continue with it. But like in
Well,
America, I
in
mean,
the US, it does.
Texas is a perfect example. They've kept their own power grid when the rest of the country hasn't, and Texas's power grid is failing. I mean, if you had all individual areas, literally or metaphorically or whatever, there are still things in. If we're starting from what we have now, which is what you said before, that are all interconnected, and if your water pipes screw up because they're interconnected to my water pipes, I can't just go, well, that's the Bernie Sanders group. They can leave it too, because that is going to flow on and impact mine in the real world today. You know what I'm saying?
Right, but this is what contracts and courts are for, right? So, of course, you're right. Texas has experimented with a sort of different arrangement about how they provide power to their
Badly.
citizens, and it's gone badly for them.
Yeah.
But you know what they do sometimes? Sometimes they buy power from neighboring states. Sometimes they, do lean on the resources of other states. They just have to make an explicit contract to do that. And that's, this is true in all kinds of, we have an interstate system of roads here, but we also have local roads and toll roads and a whole complicated network of different ways to move from place to place. And some of them belong to a municipality, some of them belong to a state, some of them belong to the federal government, and it works out. So I guess I just mean to say humans are very, very resourceful. And I don't think the big objection to what I'm describing here is like, but the power grid will, how will we share our power? Like that's solvable.
Do
I
you know what
suppose,
the objection
will
is?
we go to war with
I
each
can give you
other
the
is a
objection.
question, but
I can give you the objection. You know what the objection is? In my head, I'm thinking, oh, it sounds like Mad Max, Fury Road, whatever that's called, but what happened in Mad Max, and I think because human beings are flawed, what would happen in this world we're talking about is you would still have people, whether they're individuals or group, asserting themselves to the top, taking the power and not allowing the kind of utopian society, libertarian
yeah, and that's a
idea to
problem we have
happen.
now. I
Yeah,
agree.
totally.
Like,
Totally.
but
And
I
that's why
think
this
I
is
do
a
think
thought
we can make,
experiment.
yeah, but I also think we can make progress in this direction. Again,
Yeah.
I'm sort of just saying like directionally, what would happen if we gave, say, like to use a concrete example, what if we gave individual school districts more control over their governance, budgets, and curriculum. Right? What if we just devolved all of that down one more step from where it is right now?
Well,
Well,
we've done that.
We've done that, and
well, we've done that in New Zealand. It's called bulk funding, whereas
right.
and it didn't work at all.
But it's because not Mad Max, right? Like, I guess
no,
that's
no,
what
it's
I'm
not.
saying.
It's not Mad Max. It's not Mad Max. But it doesn't work, because what happens in that situation is then the school that's been bulk funded for the year based on their teachers and what they need has we have a pretty much free public health system. School system in New Zealand as well. Kids go to school and stuff for free, elementary through to high school, unless they pick a private school or an integrated school or whatever.
We have that too.
Yeah. Okay, cool. But then what happens, of course, is one of these schools that's been provided the bulk funding from the government and says there's the budget for the whole year sort of thing, gets a significant issue that comes up, whether it's a infrastructure issue or an influx of kids or whatever, and then they're left short. And then parents have to pay more to go to that school, and then parents leave that school and go to a different school that doesn't have that. And it's a system.
Sounds like they didn't structure the devolution right, but it doesn't mean it's not doable.
Well, it's possibly doable, but I guess I'm being fair, not saying what you're describing is exactly what we're fair, because I don't know exactly what your picture would be, but we've had two different systems run over the last 20 or 30 years, depending on the government, one being, here's all your money, go for it, and one being, we'll hold the money and pay what you need when you need it, sort of thing. And the will hold the money, centralized government, will pay what you need when you need, seems to me, as both someone who has kids going through school and has been involved with schools as an adult, the system that worked better. But that it may not be the system you're talking about, so just fair.
Well, I guess I would just ask the question, like, who is the constituency for this other system? What do they think is wrong with the centralized system? Because I'm sure they have a coherent critique. And in the US it would be among other things, that all that money comes with too many strings, and that there's and that also it takes issues that should be local. What is my kid going to read in school? Well, I'm going to go to the PTA meeting and talk with people about it. I'm going to go chat with the other parents and the teachers. Or does Donald Trump get to choose? Well, that seems like a terrible idea. So how can we build a system that doesn't get us to Donald Trump chooses what my third grader is going to read in school? Is like a pretty legit question.
The art of the deal for everybody. Reports on the art of the deal, please. Or maybe a book he actually wrote, not one he just lay on the couch for while someone else wrote for him. Look, let's wrap up. This has been amazing. I've really enjoyed it. It's been far longer than it should have been. But let's just, because originally we were going to talk about it. Tell me, Katherine, as a political journalist and a podcaster and a writer and stuff, what's going to happen now that Trump's announced moving forward for the next couple of years? What do you foresee happening? How are you approaching it? What do you want to tell us about what you're seeing in the US at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, we just had an election, right? We just had an election. And the fact that we are already starting the next one is a little bit disheartening. Ideally, we have kind of a period between elections where we do policymaking and governance. It seems in this cycle
and breathe.
And breathe in and breathe out and meditate a little bit. It seems that in this cycle that moment has been collapsed to about 3 days. And now we are in the 2024 race. I think that both of the parties have gotten themselves into quite a bad position with respect to the presidential election. They are running very, very elderly men.
Joe Biden
who are, I mean, we'll see, but
we'll
at least at this point, the presumptive nominees are two very, very elderly men who have already shown us what they have. And I would not say that Americans are terribly impressed with what they have shown us, by and large. And there will be many, many people who will hold their noses and vote for the lesser of two evils. But in the meantime, there is a real problem of affective polarization, right? So it's not, I don't think, that Americans disagree with each other more about the real stuff than they used to. But they think the other guys are more evil than they used to. Both sides.
Right.
And I think that is a really big problem, and it is going to make this election particularly poisonous. So, in some ways, I would love to say, set aside the name calling and the scandals. That's not what matters. Let's just look at what kind of policy we're going to get. But I actually think, unfortunately, that stuff is what matters, because if we end up with a with a public that has no trust in its leaders and no trust in its institutions, and that thinks that their neighbors who disagree with them about politics are actually evil rather than just wrong, it's going to be really bad for the country. And unfortunately, I think Trump is extremely primed to feed that. I think Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who is Trump's most likely rival, has shown himself to be quite a cultural warrior as well, not as extreme as Trump. But I think there are many ways in which he will be following that playbook. And Biden, who is personally less antagonistic, is leading a party that is very, very happy to play from that same playbook as well. The Democrats are delighted to say you have to vote against Republicans because they are racists who will put you in jail for thinking about, letting kids read a book about trans issues, right? I mean, it's just, I really think that there's always a golden ageism in politics. Oh, remember when everyone was civil and all the gentlemen wore hats and everything was fine? That golden age never existed. And of course, America's racial politics were horrific, even, in my parents' memory. Still deeply challenging, but the laws with respect to race were genuinely horrifying. So, it's not to say that that now is sort of the worst time ever. I don't think that's true, but I think there is a dangerous trend, which is unfortunately all about rhetoric and attitudes and feelings, and not at all about what government actually does, which is a bummer because I think we need to put in some work on that. And I have a lot of proposals that I would love people to consider, and I don't even think they're going to be on the table in this next cycle. So, it's going to be rough, is my very scientific assessment.
So you're not about to announce your bid for 2024 presidential, like you're not going to do it now. This is not an official announcement, just checking.
No, this is if elected, I will not serve. So just to be clear.
Hey, Katherine, I really appreciate that you're giving us some time today. I mean, this was supposed to be 15, 20 minutes and we've been an hour.
This is always a fun one. I love to talk with you.
Amazing. If people want to find out more about you and your views, reason.com, free minds and free markets is where to find more of your information. And the very last question, I want a prediction from you. Warnock or Walker? What do you think?
If there's one thing that Donald Trump has taught me, it's not to make election predictions. So frankly, I flatly refuse. The state, like the country, is very evenly divided, and it's going to be close. And I don't know who's going to win.
Warnock's going to win. I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why Warnock's going to win. Warnock's going to win because there are a bunch of good quality, decent Republicans who now don't have to debase themselves to vote for a brain-damaged individual because the Democrats already have the Senate. So there will be a bunch of Republicans, in my opinion, who either now won't participate or will vote for Warnock, because they don't have to lower themselves to vote for this man who should never be within 100 miles of the Senate building. And I think that's going to give Warnock the win. So I'll make a prediction, but it means nothing because I'm on the other side of the world and I can do that and be wrong and go, well, I don't know about American politics. Why would I be right?
Fair enough.
That's my thoughts anyway. Hey, Katherine, thank you so much for joining us, mate. It's been so much fun. Get well. Hope the knee recovers well. And are you going to be back on the scooters once the knee's healed?
Absolutely. I will ride again.
All right, mate. All the best.
Thanks.
All right, team. Wow, the chat was busy. No, I don't know if the chat was busy. This is pre-recorded. That was a bit of a joke. I'm hoping it was busy. And did you see those comments made by those people? Sheesh. Hey, thanks for watching. I really enjoyed tonight's conversation, and I really like to pick up on and follow through this idea that libertarianism is, in its purest, is a centrist position. I wonder if that is true, and actually, as Katherine describes it, I'm like, yeah, that feels like it's centrist. I rally against some of the right wing things you're talking about, and I support some of the left wing things. But you do go both ways, as they say. I wonder if that is the case. If it is the case, then what does that mean for all the parties like ACT, who espouse libertarianistic views, but sit on the far right with their policy? Does it mean they're not libertarian, or that they're only libertarian when it comes to right wing issues? Maybe that's it. Hey, 11 o'clock tomorrow morning, we're going to be having a group meetup with our patrons. If you want to be a part of that group meetup, you need to be a patron before 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. Everyone who is already involved with us on Patreon Hopefully we'll see at least some of you tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. for a bit of a catch-up, a digital catch-up. You'll have the link already to the Zoom catch-up. And as you can see here, as I'm showing you on the screen, BHN Patreon is patreon.com/big hairy news. There are now 7 levels you can pick from because we added in the fuck you Elon level for $8 a month. And if you like what we're doing and you want to be involved, then we'd love to have you on board. We thank the people who are there doing it for us already. A little bit that helps us, to be honest with you, kind of pay the internet and the power bills, and that's about it. I'm not saying that in a bad way, but that's where we're at, and we're really appreciative for it. So thank you very much. Patreon.com/big hairy news. And other than that, I'll see some of you tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Look forward to that. And for the rest of you, I will see you next Monday night from 10 p.m. for another edition of Big Hairy News. Hooroo.